The year was 1971 and the month November. If India pokes its nose in Pakistan, the US will not keep its trap shut. India will be taught a lesson. Richard Nixon. India regards America as a friend, not a boss. India is capable of writing its own destiny. We know and are aware how to deal with each one, according to circumstances. Indira Gandhi. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi articulated these exact words while sitting with the US President Richard Nixon in the White House while maintaining an eye-to-eye contact. This incident was narrated by the then Secretary of State and NSA, Henry Kissinger, in his autobiography. That was the day when the Indo-US joint media address was cancelled by Indira Gandhi, who walked away from the White House in her inimitable style. Kissinger, while ushering Indira Gandhi into her car, had commented, "Madam Prime Minister, don't you feel you could have been a little more patient with the president?" Indira Gandhi replied, "Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your valuable suggestion. Being a developing country, we have our backbone straight and enough will and resources to fight all atrocities. We shall prove that the days are gone when a power can rule and often control any nation from thousands of miles away." Thereafter, as soon as her Air India Boeing touched down at Palam Runway in Delhi, Indira Gandhi summoned the leader of the opposition, Atal Behari Vajpayee, to her residence. After an hour of discussion behind closed doors, Vajpayee was seen hurrying back. It was thereafter known that Vajpayee would be representing India at the United Nations. Donald Paul of BBC had jumped in with a question to Vajpayee. "Indira ji regards you as a staunch critic. In spite of that, are you sure you'd be at the United Nations shouting your throat out in favor of the incumbent government?" Vajpayee was known for his quick wit. "A rose adorns a garden, so does a lily. Each is beset with the idea that they are individually the most beautiful. When the garden falls in a crisis, it's no secret that the garden has to safeguard its beauty as one. I have come today to save the garden. This is called Indian democracy." The resultant history is all known to us. America sent 270 famed patent tanks to Pakistan. They called the world media to demonstrate that these tanks were produced under exclusive technology and are/were thus indestructible. The intention was very clear. This was a warning signal to the rest of the world that no one should help India. America didn't stop there. Burma Shell, the only US company supplying oil to India, was told to stop. They were sternly told by the US to cease dealing with India. India's history thereafter was only about fighting back, but first, Indira Gandhi's incisive diplomacy ensured oil came in from Ukraine. On the evening of December 3, 1971, just a few days after the conversation between Nixon and Gandhi, Operation Genghis Khan was launched, a series of preemptive strikes carried out by the Pakistan Air Force against the air bases and radar installations of the Indian Air Force. This marked the formal initiation of hostilities of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. The operation targeted 11 of India's airfields and also included artillery strikes on Indian positions in Kashmir. The targets were Indian air bases and air defense radars. Probably due to the multiplicity of targets, the Pakistani airstrikes were ineffectual and failed to inflict any material damage to the Indian airfields, only cratering the runways and destroying a radar station. The Pakistan Air Force repeatedly lost 4 aircraft during the raid. In an address to the nation on radio that same evening, then Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi held the airstrikes to be a declaration of war against India, and the Indian Air Force responded with initial airstrikes the same night, which were expanded to massive retaliatory airstrikes the next morning. Statements released by both nations the next day confirmed the existence of a state of war between the two countries, although neither government formally issued a declaration of war. So why did Pakistan launch a preemptive strike? In March 1971, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, declared independence from Pakistan, starting the Bangladesh Liberation War following rising political discontent and cultural nationalism among the people of East Pakistan and the brutal suppressive force from West Pakistan in response. Pakistan came under increasing criticism from India, the Soviet Union, Japan, and Europe as the flow of refugees started impacting the Indian economy. However, the United States and China showed little interest in the situation and actively opposed aid, intervention, or support. India decided to support East Pakistan independence. On the 9th of August 1971, India signed a 20-year cooperation treaty with the Soviet Union in which each promised military support to the other in the event it was attacked. This provided India cover against any possible Chinese or American intervention in aid of Pakistan if it went to war with India. To the Pakistani leadership, it became clear that armed Indian intervention and secession of East Pakistan was becoming inevitable, so they decided to launch a preemptive attack. Pakistan's strategy was based on the assumption that an open conflict with India would not last long due to international pressure, and since East Pakistan was undefendable, the war effort should be concentrated on occupying as large an area of Indian territory as possible as a bargaining tool at the negotiating table. To this end, the initial plans for the offensive called for at least a temporary cover of air dominance by the Pakistani Air Force so the motorized Pakistani troops could conduct a lightning campaign deep into western India before digging in and consolidating their positions. In order to achieve air dominance, Pakistan decided to launch an offensive counter-airstrike codenamed Operation Genghis Khan on Indian air bases. The PAF strikes were based on the same strategy of preemptive neutralization of enemy air capability used by the Israeli Air Force against Egyptian and Arab air forces in Operation Focus during the Six-Day War of 1967. The decision to hit India with a preemptive airstrike was taken on the 30th of November 1971 during a meeting among the Pakistani president, the generals, the Chief of Army Staff General, and the Chief of General Staff. The objectives of the airstrike were to surprise the Indian Air Force by attacking its forward airfields when it was least expected, to neutralize these in order to obtain at least temporary battlefield air superiority in the West, to counterbalance the Indian numerical advantage by hitting the forward operating bases of the Indian Air Force as a measure reducing the weight of expected counterattacks on Pakistani Air Force's own bases. The primary targets set for the operation were the runways and air defense radars. The final orders of the strike were issued at 17:30 on Friday, 3rd of December, 1971. The first of the strikes were mounted against Pathankot Air Base. The main target of the strike was the runway, which was damaged and took the Indian ground crew several hours to repair. These missions were unopposed since the IAF had not scrambled any interception and faced only anti-aircraft fire. The second wave of strikes was carried out against Amritsar Air Base. Within 45 minutes of these strikes, Pakistani troops had shelled India's western frontier and were reported to have crossed the border at Poonch in the state of Jammu. The third wave of the PAF counter-air strikes were directed to strike Ambala, Agra, and Halwara around 1800 hours. The Pakistani strikes ended by 22:30. 90 minutes later, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi addressed the nation on radio shortly after midnight, informing about the Pakistani attack. The Indian Air Force struck back immediately. Several air squadrons flew against 8 western Pakistani air bases: Murid, Mianwali, Sargodha, Chandar, Risalawala, Rafiki, and Mazrur. Through the night, the Indian Air Force also struck the main East Pakistani airfields of Tejgaon and later Kurmitola. At the same time, the Indian Air Force was deploying additional aircraft to its forward airfields for the strikes that were to follow the next morning. Within days, India was able to achieve air superiority. Of its stated objectives, the Pakistan Air Force was unable to neutralize the Indian Air Force in the West, which on its part had dispersed its aircraft in hardened aircraft shelters, suffering only minor damage to a few aircraft. As Newsweek magazine described the attack, trying to catch the Indian Air Force napping, Pakistan launched a version of Israel's 1967 air blitz in hopes that one rapid attack would cripple India's far superior air power. But India was alert, Pakistani pilots were inept, and Pakistan's strategy of scattering his thin air force over a dozen airfields was a bust. But probably the most humiliating defeat for Pakistan was the Battle of Longewala. Fought in December of 1971, saw how a small group of Indian soldiers, against all odds, held their ground against a vastly superior enemy force. As the cold desert night of December 4th enveloped the Thar Desert, the men of the 23rd Battalion of Punjab Regiment, stationed at Longewala, a remote border in Rajasthan, India, were about to face a Pakistani armored brigade advancing under the cloak of darkness. The Pakistani brigade was confident in their numbers and firepower. Their plan was to quickly overrun the Longewala post and make a rapid advance to Jaisalmer, a strategic location in India. But destiny had other plans. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the small Indian contingent, comprising just about 120 soldiers, stood ready. They were heavily outnumbered, with the enemy forces amounting to nearly 2,000 men and dozens of tanks, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in tactical acumen. Major Chandpuri, leading the Indian forces, made a crucial decision. He chose not to retreat but to hold his ground, a decision that would turn this skirmish into a legendary battle. He skillfully deployed his men, making the best use of the limited resources at hand. The Indian soldiers, though outgunned, used the terrain to their advantage. They laid anti-tank mines and took up strategic positions, ready to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. As the Pakistani forces launched their attack, the night erupted in a fiery display of gunfire. The battle raged on, and a small Indian force displaying exceptional bravery managed to hold off the enemy. They were aided by the timely arrival of the Indian Air Force at dawn, which proved crucial air support, turning the tide of the battle. Against all expectations, the Indian soldiers managed to destroy a significant number of enemy tanks and inflicted heavy casualties. The Pakistani forces, stunned by the fierce resistance, eventually retreated, leaving behind a battlefield strewn with destroyed tanks and equipment. After the war, because of the humiliating defeat, a Pakistani judicial commission recommended the commander of 18th Division, Major General Mustafa, to be tried for negligence. Internationally, the United States stood with Pakistan by supporting it morally, politically, economically, and materially. During the Cold War, Pakistan was a close formal ally of the United States. Besides the US, China wasn't happy with the outcome of the war. It was among the last countries to recognize the independence of Bangladesh, refusing to do so until 31st of August, 1975. To this date, its relations with Bangladesh are determined by the Pakistan factor. Another international supporter for India was Israel. Israel, despite not having diplomatic relations at the time, supplied India with armaments, ammunition, intelligence, and training ahead of its intervention in East Pakistan, which has been described as a surprising minor success of India's efforts to garner international support. In July of 1971, Israel's prime minister got Israeli arms manufacturer Shlomo Zabludovich to provide India with mortars, ammunition, and instructors. The war stripped Pakistan of more than half of its population, and with nearly one-third of its army in captivity, clearly established India's military and political dominance of the subcontinent. India successfully led a diplomatic campaign to isolate Pakistan. On state visits to the United Kingdom and France, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi convinced them to break with their ally, the United States, and block any pro-Pakistan resolution in the United Nations. The victory also defined India's much broader role in foreign politics, as many countries in the world had come to realize, including the United States, that the balance of power had shifted to India as a major player in the region. In the wake of changing geopolitical realities, India sought to establish closer relations with regional countries such as Iran, which was a traditional ally of Pakistan. The United States itself accepted a new balance of power, and when India conducted a surprise nuclear test in 1974, the US notified India that it had no interest in actions designed to achieve a new balance of power. In spite of the magnitude of the victory, India was surprisingly restrained in its reaction. Mostly, Indian leaders seemed pleased by the relative ease with which they had accomplished their goals, the establishment of Bangladesh, and the prospect of an early return to their homeland of the 10 million Bengali refugees who were the cause of the war. In announcing the Pakistani surrender, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared in the Indian Parliament, "Dhaka is now the free capital of a free country. We hail the people of Bangladesh in their hour of triumph. All nations who value the human spirit will recognize it as a significant milestone in man's quest for liberty."